Thank you very much. I think there's a lot there that certainly caught my attention, the idea of community fact-checking, community playing a role in eliminating bias. I just wanted to clarify one thing, Orit. When you talked about community fact-checking, is that before or after publication? Community fact-checking, when you get the second set of eyeballs, as it was, to look through your stuff. Are you doing that before or after broadcast and publication?
At the same time. So in Wikipedia, you have the deliberation. It's not in the entry itself, it's in the talk page. So we're going to have a similar system in Wikitribune, where as a community member, you can see all the deliberations before publication from the readers. So all you need is to sign up, and then you have access to read everything. But
interesting. All right. So that opens up a whole lot of other questions we'll save for later then.
I'm here.
We're delighted now then to get to the part where we have our interactions from our distinguished commentators here. We're going to try and stay on time as much as possible because Celso Amorim, who we all know, he has gracefully agreed to be part of this, but he does have an important flight to catch. You've got to leave at 12, haven't you? So we'll try and keep this as much as possible to time, but if you must leave and we're, still roaring on, then we will excuse you. Let's start then with Celso. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to make some initial statement and thoughts, following which we'll hear from Mr. Khanfar for a couple of minutes, and then we'll have something of a discussion, hopefully, between you two gentlemen. Let's hope the microphones are upholding our conclusion yesterday that machines can replace human beings. It's working now, I'm told. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. It's an exciting subject and very, very present one. Well, you'll excuse me because if I'm not, precisely because I'll not be here, I'll try to take a little longer than a couple of minutes in my initial comments because it's so much wealth in what was said. And I don't want to be too long. I mean, I see here the BBC, the Al Jazeera, new forms. At a certain point, I lived in UK twice, so I said the closest thing that I knew, that was before Al Jazeera, the closest thing that I knew to objectivity was the BBC. But that didn't apply to Northern Ireland, for instance. So it's an interesting thing. There is always a but. The main comment that I would make, and Al Jazeera also I think was extremely important, to help in an interesting sense, because it somehow created a sort of multipolarity in the news, which somehow didn't exist before, especially in relation to questions like the Iraq invasion and things like that. So I think that was of great importance. But let me just make one or two comments of a more general kind. Well, for me, the big news is that fake news is not new. I was in the Security Council, and I'm very glad that we had someone from Serbia here. I actually must say, no value judgment on the independence of states, but I miss former Yugoslavia somehow in the context of nations. But anyway, and nation states and multipolarity and all that. But I was in the Security Council when unilaterally NATO, which often confused as if it were a multilateral organization, it is not. It's a regional organization with certain objectives. When NATO started to bomb Kosovo, well, at then part of Serbia, bombing the Serbian. And that was a very interesting episode. I was sitting beside an ambassador of another NATO country, not a P5, but a NATO country, and we were very good friends, and he showed me some cables. But he wished to show me the cables about something else, and somehow it came to my sight also a cable that had come from Brussels, from their embassy in Brussels, in NATO. At that time, there was discussion because there was a television image that showed NATO planes bombing a convoy. And according to the NATO spokesman, which prevailed in all the BBCs and the CNNs of the world, they were bombing an armed convoy of Serbia. Well, there was suspicion about that, but it was not clear. But I saw in one of the cables that he unknowingly showed to me, and I promised not to divulge, but now it's long ago and nobody knows who he is anyway. But when he showed me to me, it said it was already proven that it was a convoy of Kosovar peasants. But in spite of that, BBC, CNN, and whatever, continue to give the word to the spokesperson of NATO, who continued to say that it was a military convoy of Serbia, which was not. Everybody knows. So that was fake news. It's not new. It was not invented by the new news media. So I'm not saying it's not important what happened. I'm very sensitive to what Harun has said because of the velocity of things and how they can be exploited and so on. But basically, it was already there, and I could mention many historic examples from sometimes in the way they are reported or they are interpreted, like the fire in the Reichstag, for instance, or elections in Brazil. When President Lula first ran for election, there was a kidnapping of an industrialist, and there was let us say the insinuation that it should have been by leftists. And Lula lost maybe 2 or 3% of the vote, which was enough for the right-wing candidate to win. So fake news is not new. Let us put it that way. And in my opinion, technology is neutral. That does not mean that we cannot and should not maybe try to regulate it somehow in a more democratic way. But anyway, technology is neutral. It could have been used when the printing press was invented to spread the dogma of the Catholic religion, but it was also used for the Protestant version of Christianity. So anyway, so that's one comment. The other one that is linked to that is the word post-truth, which is very much used in this same context. And I very much agree with our colleague, our young lady from the National Theater in Serbia, because things should be called by their names. And post-truth is just a lie. That, again, reminds me of another episode I have seen when I was in Washington long ago. That was the hearings about Nixon's impeachment. And then one of his aides said something, and he was caught in a contradiction. So in the congressional hearings. And someone asked, but you had said something else just before, which was opposite. And he said, well, I'm afraid, that was John Dean, by his name, by the way. And he said, I'm afraid that statement is no longer operative. So that's a way of depicting a lie, isn't it? Very interesting way, because it's a way of relativizing lies and truth. So nothing is important anymore. If you don't have truth, you don't have lies. You only have post-truth. What does that mean? Well, anyway, I think this is something for us to reflect about. Well, let me just, I think I'll finish here because you only gave me a couple of minutes. Maybe if there is something to react, then I would react.
Thank you very much. You know, I think I would like to say welcome to the future, because this trend that we have been talking about should be linked with what we had yesterday, the discussion about the new trends of the future. The rise of networking is a reality. One of the manifestations of it is this kind of confrontation between the old, that is withdrawing in a way or another, and the new, which is born. And the new which is born, like any newborn, is not yet stable. And this is why social media at this stage is going through turbulent situation. And in my opinion, this is not a permanent station. This is a period that will pass until there is a form of regulation, or not, I don't mean regulation, legal regulation, but I mean a form of understanding of how to use this trend. I was the one who decided 2005 to put the social media at the heart of the newsroom of Al Jazeera, and it was the first network in the world to adopt that officially as a source of news. And I think then, because of that, we were able to break away from the monopoly of the state in the Arab world. Then the Arab Spring in 2011 was covered brilliantly, not by mainstream media, it was covered actually by alternative media and through Al Jazeera lenses, and that was the great, reconciliation that traditional media made with social media. The Arab Spring was the birth of that magnificent system. Now, what I would like to say, it is important for us to realize that old media, between two brackets, is dying, simple. We have to accept this fact. There is, the business model is not going to work. We have tried to resurrect it. We have tried to put a lot of, into it. It is not, as it used to be, is not going to work. We cannot sustain a newsroom of 500 people, period. Simple, we have to acknowledge that fact. We cannot sustain huge operation of the field for 80 bureaus, like what we used to do in Jazeera. We can't. You need $500 million to do this every year, and the income from advertising is going to be minimal. Either you resort to a state where the state is going to sponsor you, thus they have to have their political agenda manifested on your screen, or you have to have an alternative model. I am a great advocate of the alternative model. For years I'm saying that traditional media has to adapt to change, and the new hybrid system is going to emerge. I do believe that it is happening right now. Social media, people are getting sick and fed of social media, by the way. The new trends of analysis that we receive for the new startups across the world is showing people are demanding something much more in depth than the gossiping and the fake news and the post-facts and many other things. Simply because it is a matter of life and death. You need to have news. If you are a businessman, it doesn't help you to have fake news. If you are a politician, it destroys your career to just tap into gossips. If you are going to be a scientist, it doesn't help you not to read proper analysis of what's going to in the world. So news, in my opinion, which is credible and analytically wise, is needed. It's going to continue to be needed like food. Sometimes you eat junk food, you get sick, but you go to healthy food. And this is what happened to us. We have been eating or consuming junk media. We are now moving into proper media. The new startups that I'm looking at, and I think this is what most of the industry now is looking at, is actually much more in-depth, analytically, accurate news and analysis. I have been saying that the traditional media should be converted into much more of flat rather than pyramid structure. It should give up a lot of tools that are consuming a lot of money, thus use the social media in certain locations, convert the editors and the newsrooms into think tanks rather than just aggregation of news, allow that to happen through other platforms, because the depth that you could provide as a proper journalist is magnificent, is needed, and social media cannot do that often. So you still continue to be valid, but not on the same structure that you used to have in the 70s and 80s. It's going to be different. So it's going to be smaller groups, much more analysts, much more deep, much more specialized, and much more investigative. There are two fields of journalism will survive from the traditional media: investigative reporting and proper contextual field reporting. These two will always survive, and they are going to be consumed, and people were going to welcome them. But the traditional kind of just reporting news as they come, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on that, I don't think that will survive. It needs to be adjusted into a new hybrid model that cuts the cost and cuts the hierarchy and reduce the amount of human resources needed for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's get the interaction going, and let's pick up on a point which you mentioned, Wadah, there. Given what you've analyzed then, do you gentlemen feel the role of the editor is about to be eliminated or redefined in the era of a flat rather than pyramid structure news environment?
I'm not sure I understood the question, really.
Well, the role, currently we've been working to the model of the gatekeeper, right, where the journalist acts as a gatekeeper, and particularly the editor as a filter. That seems to be, my question is that going to disappear because of the flat newsroom structure that you've highlighted, or is that going to be redefined?
Well, I don't, are you asking me or the...
But for both of you to interact.
Well, I really haven't given enough thought to that, but I only tend to think that the influence of big financial and economic groups will always be there, whether it's the big media, whether it is already happens even in the social networks, not only to speak about the owners of the social networks, but also of those who are able to get advertisements and so on. So some kind of filter will be there. But I'll be saying the following. I mean, seen from a very specific angle, which is the angle of Brazil, in a way, these new forms, which were made possible by the social networks, they have been so far more beneficial than the other way around, in terms of reporting at least, because, for instance, I just give an example. Our former president made a big tour of the northeast of Brazil, the poorer parts and so on. No news in the big media, no, not at all. So if you don't have the social networks, you don't even have access to that because they are just blocked completely. On the other hand, I can see how influential centers of power, not only financial, but political and very much right-wing. And again, I'll give an example of Brazil. When these scandals about our oil company started, millions went to the street, or they say millions, I don't know, because that again, it's the fake news coming. But anyway, hundreds of thousands went to the street to combat corruption. Well, it was true that there was some corruption cases that had to be analyzed, that was very important, and so on. 1 year later, you find with the current government, a minister that had just gone out from the the government, 50 bags and boxes full of cash, with the fingerprint of the former minister in some of them, in the banknotes. Where are these millions of people that were combating corruption? They were not combating corruption. They were just combating a left-wing project in the government. And so the economic forces that were able to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people, they don't exist to mobilize the people who are against what's happening now. So it's always manipulated. I mean, you tell filter, I don't know if it's filtering or it's manipulating. Just me give you one final example, since I may not have. Take the way things in Venezuela are reported. But I could mention many other things. An important newspaper in Brazil. There was a scene I saw actually in BBC, which was, there was a motorcade, kind of a motorcade of people linked to the government, the policemen and whatever, and the bomb exploded. Of course, it was a bomb. It was a bomb. It was an explosion that was provoked. Well, you go to the Brazilian paper, put a photo of the same thing, the same image I had seen, which was clearly the opposition who had fired them, and then the photo says an explosion occurred when the motorcade was passing by. Oh my God! I mean, you see, for most people who only see the photos and the headlines, it doesn't matter what's written behind. So it's again a way of manipulating. So how these filters act, it's an important thing to know.
So this is why the statement that says data, to a large extent, sometimes is accurate lies. You can have accurate data, I mean, really proper, but they're lies. You know, yesterday while you were enjoying dessert and dinner, news came through, you know, all the platforms saying that the Saudi High Commission of Fighting Corruption decided to arrest 11 princes, amongst them Al-Walid ibn Talal, who is amongst the top richest people in the world, plus many others, and, you know, ministers and business people of the country. And all the platforms just mentioned the following, that 11 princes, 24 business people, I don't know, 4 ministers have been arrested on charges of corruption. That's accurate. This is exactly what the Saudi news agency said. You know, but this is lie, of course, because they were not arrested because of the corruption. Immediately when someone, which is supposed to be now the traditional media kind of think tank, you know, operation, immediately contextualize that, analyze it, and speak about it, because it is not true. What has happened that these people have been arrested because of the fight inside the Saudi monarchy on the succession. And these guys were critical of the transition and they have to be put in jail, so the new generation of leadership should emerge. So the concept, I'm not worried actually only about fact-checking, which is important to have all the time, but I'm worried about where do you place the facts within a contextual framework that convert information into knowledge. Because my task as a journalist is to give knowledge, not only to give information or data to the public. That might be very misleading if I only stick to only verifying the data. Data verification is a step number one, but actually the final product should be a framework of understanding or a knowledge that creates a proper positioning of the data within this kind of cognitive map that the audience should receive.
So tying that into yesterday, I guess that's good news for us who work in the news business, because I'm assuming that can't be replaced by machines. There'll always be a need. I just need to change my career as a television announcer. I think it's time to take questions. We'll come to you, sir, but I think since this is about equality and inequality, I think we haven't taken a lot of questions from the back row. We have a journalist in the back, Maria. She has a question. Can I kindly ask everyone to give an opportunity to pose? And once again, you are welcome to also make a comment as well as a question, but brevity, being brief, would be highly appreciated so that we don't cause Mr. Celso to miss your flight. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot, everybody. I'm Maria Iglesias. I'm a freelance journalist publishing in Público and El Diario. And using Eduardo Suplicy's idea yesterday about exiting the rooms by the door, I would ask everybody here, speakers, commentators, or even the audience, to ask themselves, do we think that a big part of the fake news problems is related and as a result could be solved with better work conditions for journalists? Because we know, those of us who are journalists, but also those you are not, you can see it in wonderful films such as Spotlight, that journalism is a very hard and expensive work, but as we all of us say, very important, fundamental for democracy. So in the same way that yesterday there was unanimity about having a basic universal incomes, do we think that journalists, to serve better citizenship society, needs to be part of the staff of big and strong companies that can control the big powers, political and economical power, and as a result to be well paid, better than being freelancers, such as I am, and many more and more colleagues, paying by ourselves our trips to cover or not dramatic news such as the refugee crisis, as we did last year, or we trust as citizens in trusting the information done by freelancers or even volunteers, citizens. It would be worthwhile to spend the money to afford what is needed and required to pay professional journalists or not.
Maria, just to clarify, make sure we've understood your question correctly, whether corporations should be forced perhaps to pay something towards the profession of journalism, and there should be some kind of guaranteed role for a journalist posted to report on what some of the big corporations or big sources of power are doing. Is that what you're suggesting or asking? Or have I misunderstood?
No, sorry. Maybe I can say in Spanish if you're the translator.
I'll get my headset then. Go ahead.
I wait then Sammy has this. Okay. Yo sé que el periodismo y tener medios de comunicación profesionales con plantilla profesional pagada con salario mensual es caro. Y en nuestros días hablar de estas cosas parece antiguo, pasado de moda, como tantos otros conceptos. Entonces tenemos una carrera hacia adelante en la que a veces no nos paramos y nos replanteamos si esa carrera en la que estamos lanzados es la que nos conviene como sociedades democráticas. ¿Hasta qué punto el coste real económico En la forma en que se haga habría que planteársela, sea de forma híbrida, como ha señalado el señor Wadah Khanfar, sea destinando una parte de los recursos públicos a incrementar las plantillas de los medios de comunicación públicos. Esto podría plantearse, pero realmente estamos abocados sin remedio a unos medios de comunicación basados en el trabajo freelance, en un trabajo en el que los periodistas competimos entre nosotros dentro de los mismos medios para lanzar cuanto antes la noticia, la mayor cantidad de noticias posibles, porque cobramos por noticia a la pieza y el trabajo que haces y envías y no te compran, no lo cobras, aunque lo hayas hecho. Hay una precariedad muy seria de la que los propios periodistas no informamos porque tememos que sea visto como una defensa gremial, cuando es que en realidad repercute en la calidad de la información que recibe la ciudadanía y de la democracia. Y en ese sentido, algunas propuestas basadas en la cooperación voluntaria, las empresas participativas, no sé si serán una solución, ojalá, o aún van a precarizar más nuestro trabajo y a empeorar la calidad del producto informativo.
Like to have a go at that. Okay. John, you want to say something?
Sorry, just to add a point to
Okay,
that.
and then we'll take it to
a simple
Ori.
point, which is, as former international president of PEN, we maintain a list of about 850 writers, journalists in prison or murdered every year, or in prison plus 200 or 300 murdered. In a very short period of time, approximately 35% of them are now arrested or murdered for writing in social media. So that's from 0 to about 35% in what, Haroon, 10 years, 5 years? It's an amazing change, which relates to, these are mainly individuals undefended or undefendable by large organizations. It's just another part of the problem.
Okay, Orit, I think you wanted to address this, so go ahead.
What I wanted to say is that I completely agree with you. The internet is full with poor content articles, and aggregating an article from taking here and there some information and take it out there just for the clicks, because that's what's happening, is very cheap actually. You don't need a lot. You don't need a lot of time. You can make an article of those lists that I mentioned in 5 minutes and you get a lot of revenue because all you need is someone to click on the headline. It doesn't even matter if he enjoys the content. It doesn't matter if the content is high quality. And if you want a substantial investigative journalism, a high quality content that was reading after substantial research and very professional, you have to pay because that costs time, that costs professional qualification. It takes good people, good journalists to actually produce that. And for that you need to pay. And what we're trying to do in Wiki Tribune is to pay good journalists to do this kind of very important, valuable work, and take all the aggregation that sometimes is important to our volunteers, because these are the things that you can do from home, you can volunteer to do, but professional journalism, it's still a profession. You still have to have professional people doing that, and for that you need to pay. And I think that people, readers, are willing to pay.
Orit, do you find that the volunteer subscription model that you talked about can finance that 100%? Is that?
Yes, I mean, we hope so, because we launched with no ads and no paywall, so hopefully it's going to work. I know that The Guardian is trying to do that right now, because you do have access to read everything on The Guardian, but they're asking to support. And in a similar way, in different way, Wikipedia is the same thing. You can read everything on Wikipedia, but once a year there is a campaign asking people to support the project. And people are willing to pay for good quality content that they consume, even if they don't have to pay. People are willing to do that. And I think that if you want professional journalists to do high quality work, you need to pay them well, and I completely agree with her.
All right, Peter wanted to address that, and then we'll come to Haroon, and then Eduardo Barcisat here wanted to chime in on this.
So absolutely, these two currents that have been discussed, both in terms of the working conditions of journalists, which have been profoundly affected over recent years, making it more and more difficult for them to sort of gain permanent employment and to get the time and the space to develop commentary, and the threats to journalism around the world. These are two key threats that are driving down the capability of journalism to sort of support democracy. But I want to sort of add to that, that in a sense, journalism has other challenges that it has to meet as well. It's found it very difficult to cope with the rise of citizen journalism, for example, because it sees itself, in a sense, as in a position of relative authority in relation to the mediation between politics and the people. And in a sense, that fitted a sort of liberal democratic paradigm, that understanding. That distanciation, that differentiation was critical to political thinking. We hold a barrier, if you like, between the public and politics, between political systems and everyday life. And liberal democracy is very much based on that. And journalism was a fit for that notion. And professional journalism played a very important role in it. The key thing that's happening with the sort of digital revolution, if you like, is the de-differentiation of these realms. We now live in a realm of information that is flooded, that transcends these boundaries, that cannot be easily separated in the way that it traditionally was. And I think that's a huge challenge for corporations like the BBC in terms of what their role is, in terms of what constitutes the public interest in these sorts of contexts.
Please go ahead, Harun.
Yeah, you see, I mean, hoping for something is not reality. We all hope that subscriptions will pay for it, but there are very few real examples of subscriptions paying for these things. The Guardian is losing tons of money. Newspapers are losing tons of money. There are only 3 successful models in the United States. One is the New York Times, the second is the Wall Street Journal, and third, in a limited way, is the Boston Globe. Outside of that, we find that across the world, even in Turkey and India, where population and demographics sustained and delayed this revolution for a long time, reality is catching up now. The only option that we find where it works, where there's a linguistic barrier, like in French in Quebec, for example, or in pockets of India where there's vernacular press, that people would sustain to read in their own language, reflect their own culture. Outside of that, there are no successful models. The only other successful model that has been talked about, and it is not state bureaucracy, the CBC in Canada, the BBC in England, ABC to some extent, PBS in the United States, a slightly different model. These public models continue to produce good journalism. And there is
that the model for going forward?
It may be. In fact, that model is being discussed.
And getting back to the title, can that eliminate
Sami, let me finish what I'm saying without interrupting. BBC, ABC, and so on are continuing to produce good journalism. They are subsidized by the state, but they are not directed by the state. This is not Saudi television we are talking about. This is a model that's being seriously discussed at this point in Canada, in other parts of the world. So to hope that hybrid journalism will somehow be paid, that journalists will not be exploited and paid nothing is a pipe dream at this point. That reality is not translating into facts at this point.
Thank you very much. My interaction is intended in the best of faith. I apologize if it threw you off your train of thought, but it's, I understood that we want to keep a dialogue going as much as possible, so I hope it's understood. We had a question, I think, or a comment from Eduardo, and then we'll take one from Ayo.
En la historia del poder es esta del conflicto entre saber y poder, cómo se produce, cómo se circula y cómo se consume la información. Desde que existe registro en la historia social, esto permanece incambiado. No estamos hablando de la verdad absoluta ni de la falsedad absoluta. Estamos hablando de estas situaciones en que en base a un hecho cierto hay interpretaciones diversas. ¿Cómo podemos determinar criterios de verdad o de falsedad? Creo que hay una sola fórmula, es el pluralismo de la información. No podemos tener un sensor que indique qué es verdadero y qué es falso. Lo que necesitamos es pluralidad. Y esa pluralidad enfrenta un problema, el problema de la propiedad de los medios de comunicación. Entonces tenemos que crear algún sistema, pensar y propiciar algún sistema que no sea el estatismo único de una sola fuente de información y que no sea tampoco la libertad de mercado que termina fagocitando a quienes intentan producir una información alternativa. Querría pensar que este requisito de información veraz y adecuada, que recordemos está en la Convención Europea de Derechos Humanos, de brindar información pública veraz y objetiva, se logra mediante el apoyo estatal a universidades, sindicatos, centros culturales, para que desde allí haya producción y circulación de información, para que el usuario y consumidor de información pueda tener una diversidad en la que informarse. Creo que no hay otra alternativa, pero es un tema enormemente acuciante porque, vuelvo a decir, la comunicación social es hoy día el gran normalizador, entre comillas, de las conductas y por eso debe ser tratado con suma profundidad y cuidado.
Ayo, you had a comment to make.
Yeah, I want to nail my colours to the mast of, because CNN used to have, or I don't know if they still do, had this thing, slogan, be the first to know. A slogan which I found really irritatingly meaningless. I'm not a diplomat, I'm not selling shares on the stock market, and even if I were to instantly react to news and so on. So I think that be the first to know mentality is part of the problem that is driving the problem of fake news. And I appreciate those who say that they want to just call it lies. But I think it's important that we do use the element of news in it because these are not just lies that are told, but they are lies that are presented as news. So I think that if we don't use the expression fake news or false news, then we lose the element that it's actually being presented as if it were a genuine news story rather than the lie that it is. So I think we somehow need to use that expression. I think the last thing I want to say, and this is partly in reply to Peter, is that if you are, you may have started off with the idea that the BBC is the fountain of wisdom, but I think that it's important to also recognize the extent to which even the most trusted news media sources don't tell the truth by omitting certain information. When I lived in Britain in the 70s, it was quite common for people to express their outrage at the way that apartheid South Africa was being treated when these people fought for us in the war. And there was rarely any mention of the contribution of non-white South Africans or non-white anybody to the war effort. Not because they were telling a lie about it, because it simply wasn't part of the story. So I think that, and that then shapes the way that people observe the news. And I think that for some of us, we have always learned to filter the news as we read it, whatever source it comes from, whether it's Al Jazeera, the BBC, Russia Today, or Fox News, although I would confess to not watching a lot of Fox, but we filter it. Whereas many audiences in the developed countries are not used to filtering. I'm not saying that audiences in developing countries are also used to filtering, but there's an extent to which if I was a normal British person, I would assume that what I hear on the news is true, and it's been a surprise to see this other sort of thing. And therefore, my filters are not as developed as they probably need to be in, and so I go from one extreme to saying everything the BBC says is true to everything the BBC says is lies, it's all fake news. And I think that for all of us, whatever level of society we come to, we need to develop these filters and this ability to sift by using several news sources. I mean, even in Nigeria, we're always having certain lists produced about ethnic balancing or imbalancing. And you always select the list that suits your particular narrative. But when the presidency comes out and says, well, this is actually the full list, then you begin to see that, oh, actually, the ones that I've chosen as the important part of the list are not true. But we all fall for it until something better or something different comes along.
So definitely, fake news is not a new phenomenon then. Okay, go ahead, Steve, and then we'll come to Professor Black.
One thing that I think is behind the problems the media is having is that it's, for a capitalist set of institutions, they have yet to develop an effective business model for one of the biggest innovations in capitalism's history, which is the internet, which of course was invented by DARPA. It's quite strange they haven't built a funding model that works. So I subscribe to 3 newspapers, The Guardian, the New York Times and the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm damned if I'm going to pay another $8 a week to read the Financial Times. But that's the only model they've got. And the absence of a micropayment system, I think, is a huge reason why we haven't seen journalism able to survive the threat of the internet. But there are 3 institutions that I'm aware of that I'll mention now which are trying to do that in various ways. One is a site called Patreon. I don't know how many of you know of Patreon. You probably all know of Kickstarter. Well, Patreon is a continuous time version of Kickstarter, and I'm supported by Patreon as it happens, but I also know some journalists who are there to get their individual role as journalists supported on a month-by-month payment. There's another site called Inkl, I-N-K-L, and that's attempting to do a corporate-level subscription service. You pay, I think, $15 a month, and I'm paying for that myself at the moment, and that tries to aggregate a range of news services, and then each time you click on a story from a particular news provider, then that news provider gets paid something like 10 cents. So that's another attempt around it. And the final one is one that I hope would work, but it doesn't seem to have succeeded thus far, but it's now trying to reinvent itself. It's called Flatter, F-L-A-T-T-R, short for Flatter. And that goes on any website, so it can be individuals, writers, and if you click on the Flatter link, then rather than just like a like on YouTube or so on, which simply gives some sort of positive and negative social media comment, each click on the Flatter link gives a certain percentage of the money that you devote to Flatter. You might say give $10 or $100 or $3 per month, and then your Flatters are allocated out on the basis of how many of these individual Flatter links you click on web pages. So there are 3 attempts that might be a way of making a form of micropayments work for journalism, because without that, the whole idea of firewalls and you've got to pay for every newspaper, for any article you wish to read, is never going to work.
Stephen, are any of those actually being tried and tested right now?
Oh, they're all working.
Right.
They're all, Patreon is up and live. Patreon has over 1 million subscribers right now. Inkl, I don't know how many subscribers it has, but it's live. It's been live for about a year. And Flatter just relaunched itself about 2 or 3 months ago. Interesting.
Bob, before we come back to you, with your permission, can we bounce some of these ideas off any members of the panel who would like to, or the commentators who'd like to have a go at that? Then we'll come back to you, Bob, with your permission. Thanks.
I would certainly not give up, but let us say postpone my 2 minutes to the Mr. Black, who actually studied anarchy. So I think it's very interesting how to see how we live in this world of anarchical, but maybe very much dominated by oligarchical factors.
Okay, please go ahead, Bob. I promised I would come back to Celso 10-2 to give him a chance, but he's happy to delay it. So,
okay. My question is, why do people fall for false news? Is it because the format of fake and real news is the same? They both take a stream of interrelated events and present a fragment of that as stories under headlines concerning something that was just said or done. No context, no cross-reference, no history. So if someone reads a fake news story and a real news story, the only difference they can tell is that they're different, and people are going to be, I'm turning a question into an answer. Well, they may as well believe the one that agrees with their prejudices, because they both look like very professional operations.
are we making a mistake, perhaps, in assuming that the problem is funding, and if we find an alternative model of funding, that we can get around this? Please, go ahead. Yes, yes.
Well, I just make one comment because I think that was aspect that was mentioned here. I mean, looking from my angle, I think the model, I mean, when I say the model, has an implication of perfection, which I would not agree with, but more or less the system of the public television or the public radio, as you have actually even in the United States and in Britain and some other countries, if properly monitored by civil society councils and so on, or civil society boards, can be better than the one. There may be exceptions, and I know in a world like we live, I mean, the fact that Al Jazeera appeared, as I said, ensured some multipolarity, at least for the way we wish that watched news, especially in relation to the Middle East, but not only to the Middle East. So I think this kind of model is absolutely necessary if you want, because if you take a country like Brazil, and I'm sure it is the case in Argentina, it's probably the case in Mexico, it's probably the case in many other countries of the world. I know, I spoke about the ones that I know better. The power, the influence of economic power in big media is such that it manipulates almost totally the minds of the most of the people, who tend to read that and they say, well, even if it's not true, there must be something behind it. I mean, that's how people react. I mean, I've been in politics in Brazil indirectly, and I see how it works. I mean, so even people who like me or who liked what I did, so you were a good guy, but those people with whom you were associated, well, I don't know, but the fact that it is the bombardment of the news all the time. I give another example from my own country, and then I'll mention some historical facts, and then I'll go. So on my own country, recently you had polls conducted by let us say, I mean, it was the conservative group, but it was the poll about the next election. And it gave President Lula 35%, more or less. The second is an extreme right wing, which, depending on the scenario, had 13 to 16%. Let us say 14 or 15. So it is 35 to 15, right? So what was the headline of the newspaper that is associated with the same polling agency? It was, Lula and Bolsonaro lead the race. Well, it's not a lie, because it's true, but the distance between them is abnormal, it's enormous, and it's, you know, so this happens all the time. Coming back to history, I'm old enough to have seen the old newsreels in the cinemas. And I don't know if anyone is as old as that, to know what was the attitude, for instance, of BBC in relation to colonial wars. But I still remember, and there was a coincidence because of the Portuguese language, which had nothing to do with the intention, but I watched it with horror to the Mau Mau terrorists in Kenya, to the Viet Cong, before the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh in Indochina. You know, all that was, in a way, fake news. So my problem is not so much if you use the word or you don't use the word, but you have to be clear that the concept is not new. That was there. It's the way you manipulate. So the crucial problem for me is how, in some cases, state power, but in other cases, big economic interests, especially financial interests, now that journalists cannot be independent financially. I mean, how they manipulate the media and even the social networks. That's the main problem. The relation between economic power, mainly financial, defined nowadays as financial capital, and the media and the social networks. This is the crucial question. Okay, so I'm sorry to have spoken too long, and I have to really have to leave.
Thank you very much. Let's extend a warm hand to Celso Amorim. Safe travel, sir. We look forward to you in next year's CAF Forum. We can continue the discussion. Harun Siddiqui wants to address us again without any interaction from me. Uninterrupted. Go ahead, sir.
No, what Celso is saying is obviously correct. Fake news is not new. Fake news has always been around.
No problem.
And the biggest fake news that we have always had was in terms of war propaganda during the Second World War, during the Yugoslav War, and every war comes with its own share of propaganda. What is new is that fake news has now infiltrated into domestic, demonstrable lies in the United States, in Great Britain, as Brexit, Peter mentioned. That is the new phenomenon. And Donald Trump is the first president elected by Facebook and Twitter, for example, telling demonstrable lies. That is the big difference. As Ayo says, we always say in our own profession, it's a subjective profession, it's interpretative, you can have different interpretations, which is why we always say read more than one source, read more than one newspaper, go to different sources and so on. And despite all their faults, and I've been a great critic of Western media, they are a demonstrably better model than state censorship in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere or in different countries. So the challenge that we face at this point is that the kind of propaganda we used to see in wars, the kind of propaganda we used to see from authoritarian regimes has now infiltrated into the so-called free world of Europe and North America. That is a new challenge, and that is the issue at this point. And to do good journalism, you need finances, and we no longer have finances. Steve spoke about the financial model. I mean, there is a financial model. Facebook is a financial model. Google is a financial model, very successful. And the other examples that you cite, they're beginning to come, but that's loose change compared to what we are talking about with Facebook and Googles and so on. And we don't have an answer, but we cannot hide from the immense problems that we face at the very core of democratic societies that, despite all their faults, is the best known form of democracy, best known form of government that people have known.
Okay, Peter, I'm curious to get, I know you like a conversation, so I'm curious to get your interaction perhaps on the point raised by Bob Black of the question of why do people, I don't want to say fall for or follow fake news. Is the issue only a matter of funding that needs to be addressed, or are other psychological and sociological factors for why people have, shall we say, been disaffected by the mainstream media that we need to look at if we're addressing, again, in this symposium or this session, you know, how to get away from fake to fact? Go ahead.
Well, I'm not completely sure about Bob's point. I think that one of the interesting things that's happened in terms of this sort of radical distribution and circulation of information in the digital world is that it can and it is very skillful at copying the formats of traditional media, and that's one of the things that it does, but it's only one of the things that it does. And in many ways, it's been the source of great innovation in terms of the ways in which information can be circulated and addressed and packaged online. So I don't think it's just a question of sort of manipulating people by disguising the fact that you're not the BBC or something else. I don't think that's the main problem. I think that most people are aware that they're not tapping into a traditional news source and that they're pretty savvy about the fact that there's many sources of information. And I think what the conversation is problematic because, I mean, just thinking of my own experience in the run-up to Brexit, there was lots of brilliant commentary and information and counter opinions and views circulating online in the run-up to Brexit. It was, in a way, better than the problematic coverage that I've talked about that came from the traditional media. So we have to be very careful here not to sort of brush everything as being sort of, you know, digital media fake news, traditional BBC truth. And related to that, I want to contest a little bit this consensus that's emerging around this historical relativity of fake news. We've always had bad news, but bad news is a different thing. It's about ideological bias in the news and about the established power having greater control over news sources. That's been the traditional problem in a sense, and the examples that people have been giving speak to that. The Mau Mau, for example, and the way that was reported by the British. And there are specific codes when the country is in conflict and at war, which become more restrictive as well for traditional news media. I think that what we're facing now is something very different. Again, in this sort of radical dispersal of the opportunity to communicate is changing what bad news means, in a sense. And we can't, it's very difficult for us because our criteria come from these traditional models, come from this traditional reading. And just a final point on Eduardo's human rights. The problem with human rights is that there's always a counter right. And the counter right here is the right to communicate. And in a sense, these new media environments radically open up the right to communicate. Yes, there's the problem about the right for us to exist in an environment where there is carefully curated knowledge and information made available to citizens, but the counter right is, and against traditional modes of communication, is the right for every citizen to communicate.
All right.
You went very fast over how it wasn't the same, that there was a radical, you said one sentence and it was too short, if I'm allowed to. Can I ask for more? How it's different from the old way?
Bad news is related to ideological bias and established power having too much control over the media. Most citizens didn't have access to the media. So these questions of the domination of particular sources of information and power and lack of access to the construction or production of information. Now, we're not in that world anymore. That was a world of scarcity of production of information. We're now sat in a world of a lack of scarcity, a saturation, and anyone can find a route to broadcasting their information. And that's a huge change in terms of how one thinks about these questions of what constitutes bad news and falsity.
All right, Orit, you wanted to make a comment on that, and then we'll come to Bilal. Yes, and that's Sasha too, I think the gentleman. I want to make sure if there's anyone in the back who I'm not seeing behind these bright lights that has a question, feel free now to put your hand up because we can't see if you've... All right, then we'll go ahead, Orit. Okay.
I wanted to address the question of why do people believe fake news, and the reason is that they are well done. People who produce them want distribution, so they know exactly how to make a fake news look genuine. They know how to make it viral because their purpose is distribution, so they know how to make the headline that everyone would want to share. The truth is, sadly, that people don't even read most of the headlines that they see on social media, but they do share. So if the headline is attractive enough, people will just share. So you're asking why do people believe? I think that most of genuinely fake news, I'm not talking about bad journalism, but actual fake propaganda news, are relatively easy to identify if you get into the website and see it's not the BBC, it's actually just dubious headlines that doesn't even look genuine. But most people don't have the tools and don't have the time to actually fact check every single news story that they see on social media. And you average day see dozens, if not hundreds of stories. You share a lot of them. Most people won't go into the bother of actually check every one of them. We are limited in time. What we do need to do to combat that is provide an alternative, to provide a fact-checked, reliable source that people can turn to check if the story is true or not without spending too much time. So that's my input on that.
Thank you very much. Okay. Did we say Bilal? Okay, and then we'll come to Natasha and then Eduardo, if that's all right. Go ahead, Bilal.
Okay. I think we've covered a range of issues in dealing with fake news, and I think essential to this discussion is the social media as a platform in terms of which the fake news is actually spread. I think what we have not addressed is that where does the burden actually lie for confirming what's true and what's fake news. And I think this responsibility has increased tremendously on the consumer. The reason being is they are faced with journalists who are being paid to actually create fake news. They are faced with citizens who purposely create fake news as well. And you are faced with institutions who draw news from social media, which is actually driven by specific interest groups. So the pressure and the burden of actually confirming what's true or not has increased tremendously. I just want to quickly point out that there is a ray of sunshine in the sky. In South Africa, just a few months ago, a company called Bell Pottinger, a very famous PR company, was actually forced to shut down. The company was using social media in South Africa to promote racism. They created fake social media accounts, Facebook accounts, and utilized this to actually draw away from a specific narrative and to take away from the corruption reporting that was actually happening in South Africa. The company was held to account. And for us, at least, this was a victory.
Why did the company do that?
It's a PR company and they were being paid. But the idea is they had invaded the social media field. Traditional media organizations are now picking up from what's trending and then reporting on what's trending.
I mean, the question, Bilal.
Yes.
A company has been paid in order to spread fake news about racism. Who paid it?
Yes. In this case, it was the Gupta family in South Africa that was paying the company to promote a different narrative on the ground. And this was
Which is for the sake of the government, eventually, or the president?
Absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
that's it. Yeah.
So the circle of utilizing social media, it has all its benefits for the citizens, but I think what's important is that governments and other news, they've tapped into how to use social media and therefore influence. And it's now becoming more burdensome on the consumer to actually distinguish what they are using, what they are consuming, and how they are actually spreading this information.
Okay, I like this interaction and the conversation. That for those of us who like conversation, please feel free to continue this mode. Okay. Okay, briefly, because we promised Natasha, but go ahead, Cheryl.
Sorry, no, it's just maybe further information that this Bell Pottinger was retained by the Guptas to, in fact, who's the president's big allies in the corruption in South Africa. But I think importantly is the fact that citizens took them on, and through things like the professional body of PR people, took it right to the UK, where they were registered as a company. Many people dropped their accounts with them. The professional body slapped a big fine on them, and they actually basically went bankrupt, and they had to close because lots of companies reacted against them. In a similar vein in that trajectory, but not on the fake news one, there's a big thing where big companies like KPMG, the audit firm, SAP, and who's the financial services McKinsey, are all being taken on by citizens in South Africa and pursuing quite big criminal charges against them for, in fact, aiding and abetting this process. So I think we mustn't underestimate the power of citizens similarly who themselves stand up with social media initially and start tackling these people. I just thought we should actually add that there is light at the end. We're not just victims, we can become active as well in countering it.
Thank you, that's an important point. Rafael, I know we're running a bit over, but we started late. Can we go on for a few more minutes? Okay. Definitely, we'll come back to Patricio as well. Natasha, beg your pardon.
Thank you. I think, well, like many complicated matters, it has many aspects to it. I would agree also with Maria. As a freelance journalist, I noticed that there's a lot of competition. So much, actually, of course, because also of the changing systems, and we don't really know where to go yet. But so much yet that you pitch something and they don't like it, or there's something that's better up on their street, they'd say, for you, if you don't do it for like 100 euros, we have 100 others for you. And then you get people who might be faster, might not check that well. But I think it's also more of a sociological issue. And in my generation, at least, I see a lot of individualism. So we all want to be unique, we all want to stand out, and it's not something bad in itself, but what I see, definitely in the Netherlands, of course, I speak from that perspective, is that we all start to live a lot in bubbles, not only online, but also offline, and we have the friends who think alike, we go to parties with the same kind of people, we hardly meet any other ones. Also, if you look at social media, many people only have people with the same values in their networks, and they share the same news. Obviously, if you're in a network where you have a certain thought, or where power people with a lot of power come in, or networks or whatsoever, who want to spread a certain message, which might we think is fake, it spreads very quickly, and they have a lot of people to defend it. So that's a bit of, that's what I see a lot now.
All right, Eduardo, if you could go ahead briefly, and then we have promised to make sure we give sufficient time to Patricio, so please go ahead briefly with your comment or question, sir.
I would like to ask Harun Siddiqui, from what I understood at a certain point of your speech in the beginning, you have made a critique of some attitudes of the creator of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. Yesterday I've mentioned that Mark Zuckerberg, in his inaugural address at Harvard University that had tremendous repercussion, mentioned that we should have more experiences of the basic income in the world, in so many countries where, well, since you are the editor emeritus of Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper, and professor at Riverside University in Toronto, and since Toronto has announced that it will start an experience of a citizen's basic income, so I would appreciate if you may inform us what is really happening in Toronto about this experience that they have announced there. I would appreciate if you may tell us.
Mr. Zuckerberg makes these pronouncements once in a while, but they're generally seen as PR exercises.
Would you speak a little bit louder,
No,
please?
what I said, what Mr. Zuckerberg is in the habit of making nice statements once in a while, but they're seen as no more than PR exercises. A company that's raking in $1 billion a week in profits, whereas journalists cannot be paid more than 100 euros and so on. So we take it with a grain of salt, what Mr. Zuckerberg does. Vis-a-vis the guaranteed annual income in Canada, what we have had, in the 1990s, we had an experiment in a small town in Manitoba of guaranteed annual income. And it fell by the wayside, and the results were never properly tabulated. But there has been a new move now, and the government in Ontario is the largest province in Canada, Toronto is the capital, and that provincial government has just now announced that they would undertake a guaranteed annual income experiment. They have selected a group of families, and they'll extend them those benefits, and they'll see how it goes. So this is a baby step that has been taken after a long time, and poverty advocates, smaller liberals and so on, have been advocating this for 30 years or so, that it would be cheaper in the long run to pay people rather than see them in poverty, get into bad health. The health system has to provide them health and so on. So it's not just charity, it is in the general interest of a democratic, liberal polity to be supporting these people. We shall see how it goes, but it's not a major experiment, it's a small experiment in one of Canada's 11 provinces.
Thank you very much. I would like to visit Toronto.
Patricio, please go ahead, and I think after that we're going to have to close it.
I'll say it in Spanish to be more articulated. Creo que nos hemos tomado gran parte de la discusión para definir un poco cuestiones que tienen que ver con el proceso de construir las noticias, de quién las construye, quién las financia, quién las distribuye. Pero creo que a excepción de algunas intervenciones, por ejemplo la de Natasha, no nos hemos detenido lo suficiente en ver quién las lee, ¿sí? Quién las discute y cómo se forma probablemente o se atomiza la esfera pública. Finalmente, cómo se generan estas nuevas formas no solo de construir noticias, sino que estas nuevas formas de generar opinión pública, que son finalmente las redes sociales. Las redes sociales no son lo que originalmente se trataba de vender o describir, no son redes amplias, son redes atomizadas, son redes de relaciones que son cada vez más estrechas, las personas tienen cada vez menos contactos dentro de sus redes. Ya no tenemos redes de 5.000 personas, tenemos redes de personas cercanas que no superan las 100, 120 personas en muchos casos. Por lo tanto, ahí hay algo que es importante de ver, porque finalmente no tenemos muchas oportunidades de generar medios más democráticos si finalmente nadie los lee. Y finalmente lo que se ejerce es un derecho a informar o a emitir mensajes más que a comunicar. Tenemos muchas barreras de acceso, por ejemplo, en el caso de los medios digitales. En América Latina eso es evidente. Uno de los países con mayor acceso es Chile, luego está Uruguay, está Brasil. Tenemos lugares, por ejemplo, el acceso rural a Internet en Perú es de 1,6% de la población. Eso es bajísimo. Por lo tanto, lo que ocurre en esos espacios es que ya hay una barrera de acceso, pero una vez que nosotros pasamos la barrera de acceso, tenemos las otras brechas digitales de las que estamos hablando, que tienen que ver con las habilidades digitales para poder leer, comparar, discutir, para producir contenido. Nos hemos obnubilado con estas ideas como del nativo digital cuando hablamos de los niños, por ejemplo, y nos damos cuenta finalmente por las investigaciones que estamos haciendo hace bastante tiempo ya, más de 10 años en esto, que tal cosa no existe, que la producción de contenido es muy poca. Por lo tanto, finalmente, pienso que el debate de los medios no solo tiene que estar centrado en la industria, en la actividad profesional del periodismo, por ejemplo, sino que en cómo se está construyendo la opinión pública y finalmente desde allí redefinir qué es un medio. De hecho, desde allí podemos redefinir incluso lo que estamos entendiendo por social media, creo.
All right, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much for, it has been a very interesting interaction and session. I think we've covered a bunch of points here about what's driving fake news, that it's not a new phenomenon, that it needs to be addressed, or one way to possibly address it is looking at other alternative models of funding journalism and in-depth journalism, the evolution that will take place, and looking forward to the future. Thank you very much.